talk a little bit. Okay, again, welcome to Humanities and Game Development. We have Athena and Emily here. Could the two of you kind of just like introduce yourselves, like name, major, year, and maybe why you're interested in game development?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to go first, Emily, or me?
Yeah, I'll go first. So I'm Emily. I am an English major in my final year, 4th year. And as for why I'm interested in game development, I have a huge passion for storytelling of all mediums. But as for why I specifically chose gaming as the mode that I express myself through, is I am really interested in interactivity and immersion.
Nice. Yeah, so my name is Athena. I am a CS and linguistics major in my 3rd year, although I'm graduating a little early. And I'm interested in game dev for kind of the same reasons. I am also really into the interactivity that games have that I think is separate from other entertainment mediums. But I also like how games in general combine so many different fields from tech to like art to storytelling and like all of those different things. I really like
that. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. Okay, so I guess for our first question, I feel like this is kind of what is on everyone's minds, but do you guys have advice for the best way to get into game development as a non-tech major?
I think I can speak for, do you want to go, Athena?
No, go for it.
I think I can speak to that because I always joke that I am like the only humanities major that is an ACM officer. One of the very few humanities majors that's in ACM in general, even as like just a member. For me, I, never really considered myself to be someone who would be so interested in tech until I joined ACM. As for me, it was all about like finding spaces like ACM or even just in your group of friends where you can create projects on your own. I think like the big barrier to humanities and tech is that like a lot of people want to do it, but a lot of people don't have the experience to do it. So then it's like that like catch-22. You need experience to have experience. And so for me, like my approach for it was to just work on like personal projects, whether that is creating a Twine game. I can explain that later. Twine is like an interactive fiction platform for like writers to create like video game type stories, whether that is participating in game jams with your friends, whether that for me like ACM, they host tutorials every fall about a beginner's guide to Unity, which I've taken myself. Like for me, it's just about like learning in spaces that provide educational tools and working on small projects by myself, even if it's for a weekend, like a game jam. And for me, like that's ultimately how I propelled myself into gaming. I currently work at a mobile gaming company, and I'm also interviewing at some like pretty big gaming companies right now too.
Yeah, I would echo that slightly. I would say that as like weirdly simple of an answer this is, the only way to get into it is start making games. You'll see that many big gaming companies actually will not interview you even if you do not have like game development, game related things in your portfolio. As for humanities and like game development, had to get into like maybe like the more humanities side of game development. I will also plug ACM Studio just like a tad. Every fall with the tutorials, I also teach the art and design track, which doesn't use any technical like coding knowledge at all. So you'll see that actually in a lot of these engines that companies work in, so like Unity, Unreal, and these kinds of things, there's actually a lot of things that don't involve coding at all. So honestly, if you can just go online, you can honestly just go online and search things in X engine that don't require coding knowledge.
Yeah.
And you'll find things and you'll find tools and plugins that you guys can look into and fiddle with. And then you can just build projects off of that. And from that, you can propel yourself into like these larger environments. And then a second part of it is just because you don't have experience in tech does not necessarily mean you can't work in games. You're like, oh, because I can't do this, can't code, then I can't make a full game. I can only work on small projects. No one in game development is fluent in every single specific niche that there is. You're not going to be somebody who does the cinematics for a game and also somebody who does like back end development. Like, that's impossible. So what you can do is you can just supplement that by working with other people, you know, and companies really like seeing group collaboration and group work on your portfolio. If they know that you can work well in a group and you've done game related things, that is like a very, very big bonus. So yeah, so those are the things I would recommend.
Yeah, like to second what Athena's saying, I can't write a single line of code. I literally don't know how to code at all. Yet, like, I still feel like I have a pretty significant role in studio. And I'm currently interviewing at like gaming companies, and they're not like, why don't you have a CS background? They understand that the role that I'm interviewing for, like for me specifically, I really like narrative design and writing. That's where I excel in, and those are the positions that are interviewing me for.
Yeah, you'll find that portfolio is king.
Oh, true.
Above your GPA, above your major,
I
above
completely agree.
school,
School,
your portfolio is what matters in the end.
That's really great advice. Thank you so much.
Of course.
I feel like this kind of ties into this question. I think Emily, you touched on it a little bit, but what kind of software do you guys use when working, or like what kind of software would you recommend?
I guess I can start. First of all, in studio, we use the game engine called Unity. I'm sure Athena can talk about that more. But for me, like the tool that I like heavily advocate for is called Twine. If you are interested in storytelling, narrative design in games, specifically like interactivity and branching paths, Twine is an incredibly simple to use tool to map out the narrative of a story. It uses incredibly basic HTML. As I said, I if you were to ask me to code in HTML, I would not know how to do it. But Twine, I would say, takes maybe like 15 minutes of tinkering, and you already know how to use Twine. It's that simple. And for me, it's been a massive tool because when my coders look at it, they can visualize where the story goes. And like for us, we have like the my programmers. So even though we use Unity, one of the programmers will create a script that converts Twine into Unity. So we just need to feed my like really crappy HTML file into Unity, and it's pretty fluent. And that's how I've been able to make like visual novels. Currently, we're making a narrative-driven puzzle game, and it's all through Twine, the writing.
Yeah, to follow that up, see, the good thing about video games is that you will use like 7 million different actual, you know, like systems and actual, I guess, oh my God, I cannot think of the word, but different apps, I guess. I'm sorry, I cannot think of the word that I was looking for. But because game development is just something that encompasses so many different fields, I personally, I'll use things like, you know, Adobe Suite. So this is like stuff like Photoshop or Illustrator, or even like things like Adobe XD if I want to prototype any like UI elements, right? And then following that, if you're making a 2D game, literally anything that can draw digitally will get you across. If you want to make a game in MS Paint, like go for it. It's possible. You can do it. Following in that line, you know, any music software, like anything from like GarageBand to like FL Studio, like you can go as like low end, like free apps like LMMS or like Max, like standard like music apps, to like stuff you have to pay like $99 a month for. Like, you know, I find myself using anything along that spectrum. 3D modeling, you can have stuff like ZBrush or Maya, which are both very expensive, or you can go the free route with like Blender. They achieve the same thing. I think when it comes to like those kinds of programs, it's kind of whatever you're comfortable with and whatever you want to learn, right, in your field. I will say something that is indispensable though is at least learning a little bit about the proprietary game engines that you will be using. So for companies or general, this is stuff like Unreal or Unity, or you see like Godot becoming kind of popular these days. This is not to say you need to know the tech side of things, but it's more so learning, oh, if I'm going to draw something, how do I import it into my program? And that kind of stuff. How do I import it into my game engine? How do I make sure I can hear the music? So yeah, I think like a combination of Unity or a game engine, and then just the whole host of whatever programs you want to use for your field.
To add on to that, I did some voice acting for a game, and I literally just it was like a game jam. So I recorded like a monologue on Audacity at 2 a.m. and I just exported into the game.
We love Audacity.
Yeah.
We love Audacity.
I also do some like pixel art, not great at it, but I do pull it out for some game jams. And for that I use Sprite. But honestly, like any pixel art software is totally fine. I just love Sprite.
Nice, awesome, thank you. So it sounds like a lot of work goes into these games. Can I ask like what your teams look like, or maybe how you find your team even?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can go first for this one.
Yeah, go for it.
So I will say again, just like a tiny plug for Studio, is that Studio already exists as like a space where people who love games kind of get together and make games, right? Like the structure of Studio is built in such a way that you let that happen. So another thing I would say is, honestly, if you have people who like games, like playing games, there's a very high likelihood that they might also like making games if they, obviously if they have like want to develop skills within like the video game niche, right? So honestly, like finding people who enjoy playing video games, I think, is kind of like the gateway to finding that kind of group to work with. As for how groups can operate, there's like a few different methods. In like a professional setting within companies, you'll usually see you have a couple different iterations of how they're run. You have some that are design forward. So companies like Blizzard and Activision, they will focus on the design aspect of things, and then developers will try to cater to design, even like biz ops. So like the business, marketing side of things will try to cater towards the design side of things. And then you have the other side of games. So this is kind of like EA or Ubisoft that focus a little bit on sort of like the monetization of things. So like biz ops comes first. How do we make this game most marketable to players? So those are the two different kind of hierarchies I usually see. As for what you'll be working with, probably like as a student, is kind of like a collaborative group project kind of feel. You might have like some people who are a little bit better at, or a little bit more experienced, sorry, not better, within engines or with how to construct certain systems, and they might lead kind of things. But overall, like you'll have that like creative freedom to be like, oh, what if we can do this? So it's kind of like you're sitting in a conference room, your game is like the blackboard that you guys are just like jotting down like brainstorming ideas on. And it's like a very open collaborative environment. I think that kind of collaboration doesn't disappear in a corporate environment either. A lot of collaboration, TLDR.
Yeah, like I'll do a quick plug for Studio 2. When I first started I've always been interested in game development just because I've always loved games. But my first years of college, before I even knew that Studio existed, because as an English major, I don't particularly look into the CS clubs. I was in a couple groups to try to make video games, but it kind of just fell flat. Like we didn't really know each other. It was all just kind of wishy-washy on the internet. But Studio was the first place that like gave me the tools to learn myself, parts about the game development. I'd never used Unity in my life before it. And also just like provide a team that's reliable. We're all UCLA students. If we can see each other, we can hold each other accountable.
It's very true.
And like I do agree, like every studio has like its own like hierarchy of how things work. Because for me, like I'm really interested in storytelling. I would say that like our hierarchy is like telling a good story, and how does everything else supplement that. I would say like a professional studio that does that is Naughty Dog. Like Naughty Dog is story first, and then everything else is to supplement that. So for us, like for like me, like I'm not looking at mechanics that are just like fun on its own necessarily. I'm looking at mechanics that can connect with the story, art that supplements the story. It to storytelling in general for me.
Yeah, I would say like Naughty Dog is an example of those like design forward things, because story like falls into kind of like the narrative design aspect of games. So yeah, Naughty Dog is definitely an example of a design forward philosophy.
Nice. Awesome. Again, thank you so much. I guess like a more personal question for the both of you, but what does your creative process look like when you're working on games?
I guess I'll speak for this one. So because like, okay, so Athena and I are both team leads, which means that we provide the idea to the club and other people can sign up under us if they like our idea. As for me, like it honestly just sparks with like, I want to tell, for example, like my, current game I'm working on, I just said, I want to do a game about a road trip. And then I think about, okay, what's a conflict that can happen in a road trip, and then literally everything like becomes under that. I recently worked on recently released my very first indie game. It wasn't created under studio, but everyone happened to just be in studio. And for that, it was over the summer. I didn't really have anything to do, and I thought, what if I made a video game about stargazing and the stories behind constellations? So I built this like whole story about like, you know, Asian American representation, mental health, you know, first love, told under the umbrella of you know, the myths behind constellations. So for me, like I'm very like idea driven, like very I keep emphasizing this, but like I'm super interested in narrative design. And then like once it comes to that, I'll usually draft a Google Doc where I, you know, put in a bunch of references for what I think the art could look like, you know, the mechanics, the story, and then I present it to my team, and we basically just like attack the document with like all of our different ideas, like no matter how stupid they are. Then we collectively go through with them. We make some creative decisions, and then, you know, every single week we set a weekly goal. I want you to finish this art piece. I want to finish this scene, and we just basically truck along to the end.
Yeah, I'll say my process is slightly different. It's not that I am not also design first. You know, I will be working as a game designer, so I better be design first. But I think I focus a little bit more on interesting systems or mechanics, or maybe an interesting theme that I want to tackle. Essentially, I like coming up with kind of like the core idea of what I want to achieve in the game, and then building things around it. So this could be, for example, the current game that I'm working on within Studio came kind of from an idea of what could we do to make a Metroidvania like non-traditional. A Metroidvania, for those who don't know, is a game that's kind of like a very open world kind of game, and there's certain areas that are blocked off until you visit other areas. That's like the core idea of a Metroidvania. Just you know, as a preface for people who don't know. So I kind of look at things like a little bit more thematically, and then I'll go through and be like, okay, so what are interesting ideas that will help, you know, maybe people explore this open world? You know, what are some systems we can design to support that? You know, how can we make the art style, or I guess like the environment, you know, push forward this idea of exploration? You know, what are some things we can do to support that as well? And then something else I would also like to say is that that's like the initial process, right? Is coming up with a theme, coming up with things that might support that theme. But when you're working on this, and like when you go further along in the creative process, I will say, if you want to work in game development or video games, you cannot be afraid of either A, scrapping your work, or B, going through a very iterative design process, in the sense that if something doesn't work, you very well might have to just get rid of it. You have like examples of games like Ape Out that started out with having a human protagonist and moving on to having a gorilla protagonist, and having to completely rework their game to support that, right? It's about what's fun for the player, and sometimes what's fun for the player is not necessarily what's the most smooth for you to work on. So I find that I myself, in this creative process, I'll like go back and I'll think, oh wait, no, like if we're changing the idea to include puzzles, then we can't have this. So we're gonna have to scrap that entirely. Maybe we can prototype a lot of these different things. And then because of that, because of how iterative things need to be, I find myself working in a very, when we start, it's a very buckshot shotgun method where we'll test like everything under the sun. And then as we go further on, we'll like narrow it down, and we'll be like, no, it has to look like this. You know, it has to be this kind of thing to make sure that we support these earlier things. Yeah.
The first game I tried to even make in studio didn't even come to fruition. The game that came to fruition was the game I made over the summer and just released now. So yeah, like it's about like accepting failure. And like
100%.
I think like one big thing that game development has taught me is to be okay with failure and to like, you know, be gung-ho about it.
100%. I mean, like, that's like part of the reason why I think humanities and game development is so important, is because I feel like in a creative field, you're very much more used to this idea of like scrapping things or like going over things or, you know, like reworking things compared to if you were a math major. It's a little bit different. So yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great perspective. Thank you. I guess this kind of ties a little bit into the last question, but are there any like particular features that either of you prefer to prioritize when working on a game?
Features. Oh, that's a good question.
What do you mean? What do you mean by features?
Like anything about like the avatar or like the player experience, I guess, is where that's directed.
Oh, okay.
Definitely.
I really like writing about complicated people. Like, or people like relationships that aren't good or bad. I guess like that's something that I really like to work towards. The current project I'm working on is the most mechanically driven game I've ever made. It is a half puzzle game, and so I guess like I've had a lot of enjoyment working on that recently because I'm not just thinking about like, okay, like what word would describe this the best? It's like, okay, like, you know, what mechanic in this puzzle would make the most sense for the story? That's been pretty interesting for me to think about.
Yeah. For me, I'll I guess like I'll interpret features a little bit differently if I can interpret them as like systems, maybe. So like things in a game that might work mechanically and might provide the player with a certain experience. I think I'm most interested in synergies, like synergistic systems, and also emergent systems. So what these are, synergistic systems are systems that work together. Let's say I have a power up that lets me shoot bullets, and then I have another power up that turns my bullets, if they exist, into lasers. So that's an example of like a synergistic system, right? Because you have two things that kind of work together when you pair them together, but they don't necessarily also have to, you know, be working together, right? You can have lasers and you can have bullets, but it doesn't mean that, you know, they necessarily have to cross. And I think that's something that I'm super interested in because in my opinion, what makes the best game is a game in which it's unified on all fronts. In the sense that everything is working towards a common goal or a common player experience. And that also kind of leads into emergent systems because when you have two things or multiple things that work together, you'll find that you'll find that like usually these new behaviors come out of nowhere that you don't expect to happen. Like for example, in a game like Far Cry, they had tigers that would attack people regardless of what people they were. And then you would have like raiders or like the enemy that would shoot at anybody that encroached their camp. And so suddenly you would see tigers that just started mauling these enemy camps that you were supposed to be attacking and just like doing your job for you. And that's not like something that they intentionally, you know, meant for there to be, but it adds so much flavor. And I think, you know, the depth that you can get with like those kinds of systems is also something that I'm really, really interested in like finding out. So yeah, I think those two things specifically.
That's really cool. I love that example too. That was pretty funny. And I guess for my final question, like, I guess well, I don't know. I feel like we've both kind of touched on this a little, but like, what aspect of video game design do you feel like your humanities background is the most important to? And like, how do those two things like work together, I guess, in a broad sense?
As for me, like again, as an English major, it's a pretty unconventional major. Like I've never met a single other English major that's like, I want to work in games. I'm the only one, right? But as for like what perspective I think I bring to game development is I think I just like give a more like humanizing and sympathetic perspective. Whenever I communicate with my programmers, they're literally like at the end of they're thinking about systems, they're thinking about mechanics. But like, you know, sometimes you want to assign a purpose to those mechanics. Sometimes, you know, you don't want to just create like, you know, sometimes we like to create games that are just fun, you know, games we play on our phone, games we just, you know, play to pass time. But I think a lot of CS majors are interested in creating products that touch people, creating products that move people. And as for me, like I kind of can like provide that meaning for them. Um, like one thing that I found super interesting was that in my latest game, when I was coming up with the idea for it, I actually worked really closely with a programmer in designing it, and he helped me design what the puzzle would look like, and I designed what that puzzle would mean in the greater context of the story. So we would just go back and forth and creating it, and yeah, I just don't think I would have been able to create such a well-rounded idea if I didn't have his perspective, and he wouldn't have known, you know, what to do with that puzzle if he didn't have my perspective.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really interesting perspective. I personally, I think I might have to disagree actually, like just slightly, in the sense that um, I don't necessarily think that being a programmer means like you suddenly like are unsure of what to do for the overall player experience. I think for me, like my linguistic side of my major has kind of trained me in a little bit of like how people think, right? Some people from some cultures are very willing to do X things, whereas if you're in America or in somewhere else in a Western maybe culture, you're not willing to do a certain thing, right? And those ideas are very important. I think the most important part that you can get from a humanities background that you can't get and maybe like a more tech or STEM based background is the player experience, right? The experience. That is the core of all games. You know, you can have a very flawlessly designed system with perfect numbers. You know, you never have a negative number anywhere. But if it doesn't play well, right, then the players, you know, anybody that plays your game is going to be like, this is programmed really badly because they don't see, you know, you're not the one, you're not going to show everybody your perfect code and be like, oh, do you see like this line of perfect numbers that I have? They're just going to focus on how does it feel, right? And as a humanities major, I think you have like a little bit of a better beat on that kind of feeling than you would if you were like a tech-based major. And I think that's like the core difference. Not necessarily if you are a tech major, you can't do that. It's just I think they train different skills. A tech major trains you on how to create the system, and a humanities major trains on how to make the system feel natural. Examples of this is like if you're like a very art-based person, you have a very good knowledge on color theory, right? And that's very important. You know, green buttons mean different things than red buttons. Blue buttons will mean different things than orange buttons. And that's like a very important thing to make sure you get right. There are games that have gone through like, entire scandals because they got the color of the buttons wrong. So I think keeping your player experience like in mind and keeping the idea of what you want the player to experience in mind is key when you're trying to pull on your humanities background.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I think that wraps up the moderator panel side of today's event, but I think we can open up to audience questions now.